Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and to our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who are joining us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. For those in-house, as we prepare to begin, please make sure cell phones have been turned off. It is a courtesy our speakers do appreciate. We will post the program within 24 hours on our Heritage homepage for your further reference as well. Hosting our event today is Stephen Buchi. Dr. Bucci is director of our Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies. He previously served Heritage as Senior Research Fellow for Defense and Homeland Security. He is well versed in the special area operations and cybersecurity areas, as well as defense support to civil authorities. He served for 3 decades as an Army Special Forces officer and top Pentagon official. In July 2001, he assumed the duties of military assistant to Secretary Rumsfeld and worked daily with the Secretary for the next 5.5 years. And then upon retirement from the Army, he continued at the Pentagon as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Homeland Defense, and America's Security Affairs. Please join me in welcoming Steve Bucci. Steve?
Let me add my welcome to all of you. I think you're going to have a real treat this morning. As John mentioned, I'm a Special Forces officer by profession, and so this area is near and dear to my heart because this is kind of what we do, or did. They don't let me do it anymore. I mentioned to Max when he came in a little historical artifact in that when I was a cadet at West Point, I bought a book that had just been published. It was a 2-volume set. It was called War in the Shadows, The Guerrilla in History by Robert Asprey. That book from 1975 till now really has been the sort of benchmark for this kind of historical review of this subject area. That's a long time for a book to keep that sort of position. Well, with apologies to Mr. Asprey, I think his book is being replaced now, and Max has done that. With this book, which is on sale outside, Invisible Armies, he, I think, has set the new benchmark for this subject area. His book is very, very comprehensive, and it's somewhat chronological, but not entirely. And it's somewhat regional, but not entirely, and it's somewhat not functional is the right word, but topical, but not entirely. That sounds like it's not organized well. I don't want to give you that impression. It works very well. It flows well. Max is a really, really fine writer, and I say that from the standpoint of a reader. It's very easy to read in a way that sometimes historical works are not. So I would recommend it highly. What we're going to do this morning is when I get done introducing him, Max is going to give some opening remarks for a little bit. Then we're going to open it up to questions and answers. When he's done with his prepared remarks, I will come back up and play moderator. I will tell you now, when you ask a question, I'd like you to stand up, identify yourself very briefly, and if by the end of the second sentence I don't hear a question mark, I'm going to ask you to sit down very politely. Because the object of this exercise is for you to ask questions and draw from Max's knowledge and from information he presents about the book, not to give a speech. If you want to give a speech, come see me afterwards. We'll see what we can arrange to get you your own program. But that's where we're going this morning. For those of you that don't know, Max Boot is one of America's leading historians in military history and one of our best historical writers. He is presently the Jean J. Kilpatrick Senior Fellow for National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. He continues to write extensively in the Weekly Standard, the Los Angeles Times. He's a regular contributor to the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. He's been an editor and a journalist for the Wall Street Journal, for Christian Science Monitor. He's written 2 other major books in the past that are of interest to me. The Savage Wars of Peace, Small Wars and the Rise of American Power, and War Made New, Technology, Warfare, and the Course of History, 1500 to today. Max tends to write like really big books. And this morning, he's going to talk to us about his latest, Invisible Armies. With that, turn it over to you, Max.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you very much, Steve, for that warm and generous introduction, and thank you also for your many decades of service. And indeed, I see a lot of folks here who are either current active duty or retired military, and I thank all of you for your years of service to the nation. Well, what I'm here to talk about today is the contents of my new book, which, as Steve mentioned, is a history of guerrilla warfare. And although it may seem thick and daunting at first glance, I did try to tell a good story that it sort of encapsulated 5,000 years of guerrilla warfare history into one book. Now, that may seem like a formidable undertaking, but here today in front of your very eyes, I'm going to do something that I think is even harder. I'm going to try to encapsulate the entire book into about a 25-minute talk. So that's going to work out to about 200 years per minute. So fasten your seatbelts. We're going to go for a little historical journey here. What I'm going to do is first talk about the origins of guerrilla warfare. Then I'm going to talk about how to counter guerrilla warfare. And finally, I'm going to conclude about why it's incredibly important that we figure out how to counter guerrilla warfare. The question that I'm most often asked when I tell people that I've been writing a book on the history of guerrilla warfare is, what's the first guerrilla war? And the answer is, guerrilla warfare is as old as mankind itself. It's impossible to say when the first guerrilla war took place because that is essentially tribal war. Tribal warriors going back to the dawn of mankind have been fighting with hit-and-run tactics. They've been staging ambushes. They've been attacking enemy villages and fleeing before the main force of the enemy can arrive. They don't stand toe-to-toe and slug it out with the enemy in the way that Greek hoplites would or the way that we imagine that conventional army should. So in essence, tribal warriors have been taking part in guerrilla warfare for countless years. By contrast, counterinsurgency warfare and conventional warfare are both relatively recent inventions. They were only made possible by the rise of the first city-states in Mesopotamia about 5,000 years ago. By definition, you could not have a conventional army without a state. And so until you had states, you had no conventional armies, which had officers and enlisted ranks and a bureaucracy and logistics and all these other things that we associate with conventional armed forces. But guess what? As soon as you had the very first city-states in Mesopotamia, they were immediately being attacked by nomads from the Persian highlands, essentially guerrillas. And so from the very start, organized militaries have always spent a lot of their time fighting unconventional, irregular warfare. And you know what? Those terms don't make a heck of a lot of sense. That's one of the big takeaways that I had from doing 6 years of reading and research for this book. The way we think about this entire subject is all messed up. We think that somehow conventional warfare is the norm, that the way you ought to fight is to have these conventional armies slugging it out in the open. But the reality is, those have always been the exception. Just think about the more modern world. What was the last conventional war that we saw? This is a hard question to answer because, in fact, it was the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, which didn't last very long. And yet, all over the world today, there are people who are dying in war, whether it's in Afghanistan or Mali or Syria or Congo or Myanmar or Colombia or many other countries. All these people are victims. They're being ravaged by unconventional warfare. But the term, as I say, is off because this is, in fact, the norm. We have to adjust our thinking. We have to flip our thinking 360 degrees and understand that unconventional warfare is the dominant face of warfare, always has been, always will be. Every great power throughout history, every great general, including the great generals of antiquity, had to deal with the threat of unconventional warfare, including, of course, the greatest army of all, the Roman legions, a pretty formidable force, even when they were not led by Russell Crowe. They bested every power in their neighborhood. But Rome, as we also know, was ultimately brought down, sacked in the 5th century. And what was responsible for the downfall of Rome? Well, Rome was much like the United States in that it did not have